Now, the global CEO of Uber has said sorry to Londoners after it was stripped of its licence on Friday, admitting they had made mistakes. The firm's boss wrote an open letter confirming they will appeal the decision. So far, more than 700,000 people have signed a petition calling on TfL to reverse it. Well, following the apology, London's Mayor Sadiq Khan says he will now ask TfL to meet with Uber on the first day of the Labour Party conference in Brighton. He spoke to our political correspondent, Simon Harris.
Sadiq Khan hasn't always been a Jeremy Corbyn fan, but you'd never have guessed it from today's speech. Publicly, London's mayor and the Labour leader have buried the hatchet. At the last minute, the mayor was allowed to address the conference, and in return, he praised his leader's election performance.
Credit must go to one person, the leader of our party, Jeremy Corbyn.
The mayor invited delegates to give London's 999 workers a standing ovation. He talked about terrorism and violent crime. But on the controversial decision to deprive millions of Londoners of their favourite minicab service, there was no mention. Last week, Transport for London decided not to renew Uber's licence. Today, the company conceded there was one occasion when it failed to report a driver to the police.
The specific situation was the passenger wrote in, they said they had a great trip, but after the trip it was a bit odd because the driver hugged them. Now clearly that was very inappropriate and we spoke to the driver around it, but we just didn't realise in that incident how serious it was, and that was a mistake that we made.
In an open letter to Londoners, Uber's chief executive officer said while Uber has revolutionised the way people move in cities around the world, it's equally true that we've got things wrong along the way. On behalf of everyone at Uber globally, I apologise for the mistakes we've made.
It's great to see an apology, but in order to believe this is more than just a cynical PR stunt, we need to see concrete actions on drivers' pay terms and conditions, on passenger safety, and also paying their fair share of tax here in the UK, not abroad in the Netherlands.
Sadiq Khan knows TfL's decision on Uber is popular among many delegates at the Labour conference.
Sadiq Khan and Transport for London withdrawing the licence from Uber has gone down very well here. I think people here understand that it's about fairness.
Will you talk to Uber?
Well, TfL are the people that decide the application process. I've said they should make themselves available for the global CEO, who seems to have a bit more humility than the British team, and he wants to address some of the concerns that TfL have identified. Thank you.
The mayor has taken much of the flak for TfL's decision, but today at least he was among friends. Simon Harris, ITV News, Brighton.
For political journalists and seasoned politicians alike, the party conferences mean a trip to the seaside and a time to get your key messages out, while the country gets a sense of where a party is heading and whether a leader is safe. But what is it like for new MPs, many of whom may have attended as delegates but now have new responsibilities in Parliament? Well, at the Labour Party conference in Brighton today, our political correspondent Simon Harris spent the day with not one but three London MPs at their first since being elected.
They're three conference veterans enjoying an unexpected new experience. Emma Dent-Coad, Marcia de Cordova and Sarah Jones are making their first appearances as members of Parliament.
This time last year, I was a delegate. Now I'm an MP.
It's a huge surprise, but it's a great surprise. It's a good one.
It wasn't a surprise to me.
16,333 votes.
Emma Dent-Coad's triumph in Conservative-held Kensington was one of the shock results of election night, but hers and Labour's celebrations were short-lived.
Because of what's happened in my constituency 4 days after I was elected, I've been rather defined by Grenfell. So many things have come together at Grenfell about the way that the cuts have affected everyday lives, the way they've affected the way people view housing, the way that social housing is viewed, the way that people who live in social housing are viewed. And it's basically a lot of issues coming together around that horrendous act that happened that night.
I do hereby declare that Marcia Chantal de Cordova.
Marcia de Cordova's victory in Battersea was equally unexpected, overturning a Tory majority of almost 8,000. The former charity worker suffers from an incurable eye condition and relies on her assistant, Sarita, to help her get around.
I have a condition called nystagmus, which is an involuntary movement of the eye. So you've probably been seeing throughout the filming that my eyes are wobbling from left to right, up and down, and so forth. And I actually call it my wobble. And I was born with the condition, and it just causes me to be severely visually impaired. So I can't read standard print. I read things in very large print.
Marcia de Cordova now wants to inspire other people with disabilities to become politicians. With Labour declaring itself still on an election footing, the new MPs have found themselves in demand at this conference. Other delegates are eager to hear how they did it and pick up tips. Sarah Jones has already given a talk here on how to win a marginal after taking Croydon Central from the Conservatives. She relied heavily on the Corbyn-supporting Momentum movement, even though she's not a natural Corbynista.
I didn't vote for Jeremy Corbyn, so you could put me on that kind of moderate wing, but you know, thousands of people from Momentum came and helped me win, and they are wonderful people who've got a huge amount to contribute in terms of new ideas, new ways of doing things.
Marcia de Cordova!
London's new Labour MPs have been allowed a few moments to bask in the glory of their triumphs this week with a shout-out from Sadiq Khan. And tomorrow they'll be strategically placed on the main conference stage for Jeremy Corbyn's speech.
Well, we can cross to Simon in Brighton now. We heard Emma Dentko there describe how her first few months in office was dominated by Grenfell, and the response to that fire, that tragedy, has been a key theme of conference today.
Yes, Nina, although party conferences tend to be set-piece events built around major speeches by senior figures, here at Labour they do allow emergency debates. And today the Grenfell Tower disaster was discussed by delegates in the main conference auditorium. There are many in Labour who think the public inquiry is too narrow and should look more broadly at government policy on social housing and whether fire and building regulations have become too relaxed in recent years. And the General Secretary of the Firefighters Union went as far as to threaten to boycott the inquiry.
I give notice to that public inquiry that if ourselves and the representatives of the community conclude that the whole thing is working towards a whitewash, then we will reconsider our approach to that public inquiry and whether we cooperate with it.
That wasn't the only intervention. One former firefighter from Scotland described the fire as a class-driven atrocity. Tomorrow, Jeremy Corbyn gives his main speech, and as a London MP, I would be very surprised if he didn't also want to talk about the disaster at Grenfell Tower. Nina.
Simon Harris, thank you. The investigation into the cause of the Grenfell fire has only just begun, but Jeremy Corbyn today laid the blame on the Tories. The Labour leader chose his big speech at the party's conference to condemn the Conservatives for their housing and economic policies. He said the wreckage of the tower is a chilling monument to their failures. For the details and reaction, here's our political correspondent, Simon Harris.
To Jeremy Corbyn, the Grenfell Tower disaster was more than just a tragedy. It was a symbol of everything he despises about the Conservatives. And in his conference speech, he didn't hold back in using Grenfell to bash Theresa May's government.
Now that degraded regime has a tragic monument, the chilling wreckage of Grenfell Tower.
The fire is now the subject of a public inquiry, but Mr Corbyn told delegates it was entirely avoidable.
An indictment, not just of decades of failed housing policies and privatisation, and the yawning inequality in one of the wealthiest boroughs and cities in the world. It's also a damning indictment of a whole outlook, which values council tax refunds for the wealthy above decent provision for all, and which has contempt for working-class communities.
London's mayor hasn't always been Jeremy Corbyn's greatest fan, but on Grenfell, the two are united.
The Grenfell Tower was something that could have been prevented. It didn't need to happen, and one of the consequences of cuts, one of the consequences of deregulation is a situation where you've got a fire that could have been prevented.
We're homeless.
Mr Corbyn won praise from many local people when he visited North Kensington shortly after the fire, but not all of them agreed with him today.
I think both the Labour government and the Conservative government have a responsibility for the situation we are in. And I think what we need is tangible actions rather than promises.
Mr Corbyn also attacked council estate regeneration schemes like Cressingham Gardens at Tulse Hill in South London, where many residents opposed the demolition of their homes. The Labour leader said some schemes amounted to social cleansing, and he promised radical new rules if he becomes Prime Minister. Under Labour, councils would need the permission of tenants before embarking on regeneration schemes. And existing residents would have to be offered new homes on the same estate at the same rents. Labour has now launched an in-depth study of social housing policy, with the party leader pledging to unveil the results at next year's conference.
As you can see, Simon is back from Brighton and with me now. Look, Grenfell's MP, Emma Dent-Coad, will have agreed with everything the Labour leader said about the fire today. But earlier in the day, what she has said earlier in the conference threatened to overshadow that big speech.
Yes, Emma Dent-Coad raised quite a lot of eyebrows with remarks she made at a fringe meeting at the conference earlier this week, remarks about the royal family. Now, some of the royals live in her constituency in Kensington Palace, but she's a Republican and described herself as the royal family's worst nightmare. She also said that Prince Harry can't actually fly a helicopter, that he'd failed his pilot's exams and just sat in the aircraft going vroom, vroom. Well, in fact, Prince Harry is a qualified helicopter pilot. He flew the Apache gunship helicopter in Afghanistan and is highly regarded. Well, I caught up with Emma Dent-Coad at the end of the conference.
People have picked up on a bit of joking, messing about. I had a poke at the royal family. You know, hands up, hands up. The issue is taxpayer funding of the monarchy. Please, can we have a debate?
Do you owe him an apology? Well, some of her fellow Labour MPs do think she owes the Prince an apology. Sadiq Khan didn't quite go that far. He told me, though, he's a big fan of Prince Harry and the monarchy, thinks Prince Harry does a great job.
All right, Simon Harris, thank you very much.